We studied a number of healthy volunteers and watched the brain uptake of the omega-3 DHA and then compared it to alcohol patients. And it turns out that when someone is in recovery from alcoholism, their metabolism for DHA is greatly increased. So when they stop drinking, the brain is sucking up more DHA.
Welcome to Power Up Recovery with Nutrition. It is time to make nutrition part of the conversation. I'm your host, Christina Veselak, and I'm so glad you're here. Did you know that it's our brain's job to allow us to cope with stress gracefully? But to do that, it needs to be fed optimally. Have you ever wondered why so many committed people relapse or maybe even die? Why so many people on psychotropic medication still feel lousy and still have cravings? What if the missing piece is food, the right food? What if the right nutrients like amino acids or even eating protein every 4 hours could actually balance your brain chemistry and your mood without medication and support lasting recovery? In this podcast, we explore the powerful connection between feeding your brain well, mental health, relapse, and recovery from addiction. We will share insights from experts, inspiring recovery stories, and practical strategies you can use today. Whether you're in recovery, a healthcare professional, or someone passionate about emotional well-being, this show is for you. Let's dive in and discover how fueling your body and brain with the right food, the right amino acids, and other key nutrients can fuel your transformation today. Welcome. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the newest episode of Power Up Recovery with Nutrition, where we hear wonderful success stories. We interview scientists and professionals in the field about how nutrition can transform your recovery journey and your life. Today, I am delighted to introduce Dr. John Umhau. And let me read my professional career has been dedicated to helping people stay healthy. I love that one. I enjoy directing and consulting on research. Today, my private medical practice focuses on assisting those who sometimes lose control over how much they drink. I provide evidence-based medical and nutritional strategies to help professionals without depending on willpower-based treatment methods. I use telemedicine in a way to provide off-the-grid and private care without the risk of an electronic medical record. I'm sure that's appreciated by a lot of people. With 20 years of experience as a Senior Clinical Investigator at the National Institute on Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism of the National Institutes of Health, I have extensive expertise in leading multidisciplinary neuroscience research teams in early drug development and the investigation of nutritional therapy. I also have experience as a medical officer at FDA, tasked with reviewing psychiatric drugs, and leadership experience as a clinical director in various organizations. I think that is a wonderful history.
Thank you very much for that nice introduction, which is really, I feel very fortunate to have had those opportunities, particularly at the NIH. That was a wonderful learning experience.
Amazing.
Yeah.
As you shared with me before, you started out with an interest in preventive medicine.
Yes.
You've been introduced to functional and alternative medicine kind of along the way and like it, but it wasn't really the focus for a lot of your work, although you have done research with omega-3 fatty acids, and we just started talking about butyrate. So I'm really interested in picking your brains about what you know about fatty acid approach, whatever they may be, to addiction recovery. Let's start there.
So sure. So when I was at NIH, I was fortunate to work with a group that was developing a way to measure the omega-3 fatty acid DHA and measure it using a positron emission tomography technique where we radio label DHA in the brain. And we wanted to see what the uptake was and how it was different in alcohol patients. So we knew that if we exposed rhesus monkeys to couple of years of alcohol, their brain would lose DHA, would lose the omega-3. And that was established in the animal models. And so we want to see what was going on in humans. Could this be some way to understand it? So that's what we did. We studied a number of healthy volunteers and watched the brain uptake of the omega-3 DHA and then compared it to alcohol patients. And it turns out that when someone is in recovery from alcoholism, their metabolism for DHA is greatly increased. So when they stop drinking, the brain is sucking up more DHA. And so I published that. This is my 5 minutes of fame, was in this magazine article called the Journal of Lipid Research, where you could see the pictures of the brain there on the cover.
Sure.
But we were able to show that the half-life of DHA in the brain was 2.5 years, a long time. Subsequently, I've really come to appreciate how important DHA is, because DHA makes up about 40 grams in the brain of this element. It's completely essential. The only way to get this is from your diet. And in practice in America, because we have so much omega-6 that competes with the metabolism of the plant-based omega-3s, really, if people don't eat fish, they're going to be deficient in the omega-3 DHA. If you're drinking all the time and you're not eating well and you're not eating fish all the time, your brain is going to be deficient in DHA, and it gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And this atrophy in the brain is what I have often seen in the emergency room. So doctors routinely will do a CT scan on somebody's had a head injury in the emergency room, and they'll say, "Oh gosh, this guy probably has alcoholism. Look how his brain has shrunk. Look at how atrophied his brain is."
Oh,
and it's
my.
a very
I did not know that.
Very common finding. It's nobody questions it, but nobody thinks about it and does anything about it. There's no scientific proposals out there to increase the brain volume of alcohol patients to heal them. And in fact, just feeding them, if people stop drinking for over 6 weeks, their brain will have regrown back 2% in volume. It's a huge volume increase just by stopping to drink. And
lovely. The body likes to repair itself, doesn't it?
Right. So the people that have had poor diets are more likely to have alcohol problems in the first place. And what I found in my private practice is that oftentimes those folks have been eating really well anyway. Otherwise, they wouldn't be able to make it. Find me on the web and check into my private practice.
Right. These are not the street folks.
Right. These are folks that recognize that they have a problem. They recognize a problem because their brain still works well. And they take the medicines, they'll take naltrexone as needed because their brain works well enough to recognize that they need to take it. So the first thing I do when I treat patients is I improve their nutrition. And oftentimes the one thing that matters is to give them high dose fish oil. So, people talk about, taking a fish oil capsule once a day. And I used to give that to all my patients. What really matters is when they get a high dose fish oil, commensurate with the size of the brain loss. 40 grams is a big amount of brain loss. For instance, the brain only contains 200 grams of protein, the whole thing. And then of that, we've talked about glutamine, maybe 15 grams of glutamine, but it takes 40 grams of DHA to make a brain. That's what the brain cells are made of. It's also what the brain uses to think with. So I supplement that with fish oil for my patients. And when they take a lot of fish oil,
So John, what's your definition of a lot of? What's your definition
this
of
bottle here this is a week's supply.
Okay.
So a bottle a week of fish oil. And people can take that, however they want to. They can take it every other day, or they can take it throughout the day. But about that, it's the studies that we've seen with bipolar disorder, which is a severe mental illness, was done by Andrew Stoll in 1998, I think it was, at Harvard, and he looked at people with severe bipolar disorder. And he had thought that perhaps the anti-inflammatory effect of fish oil would help bipolar patients as it helps people with arthritis. And so he didn't use a little dose. He used the dose for arthritis, which was about 9 or 10 grams, 10,000 milligrams a day for these patients. And he compared with placebo in this double-blind study at Harvard. And it turns out after 3 months, the endpoints were definitely different. So he would measured, did these severely ill patients have to go back to the hospital? And 1 or 2 of the patients on the fish oil went back to the hospital, whereas 60% of the people on the placebo went back to the hospital. Phenomenal difference, but it's a big dose. And they've tried
10 grams is a big dose. Yeah.
Right. So that's a big dose. So that's, a couple tablespoons, or depends on the type of fish oil. But the idea that I've always had is that we don't see those results commonly because people don't give enough dose. It's not the right dose.
I was at a meeting last week with a group of researchers, conventional medical researchers, looking at long COVID.
Right.
And they're doing a study using tirzepatide for long COVID. And so I asked the group, there were maybe 10 researchers there, doctors, if anybody had ever used fish oil to lower inflammation in long COVID, or if there was a study going on. And they kind of looked at each other and no, there's no study going on. And then a couple of people said that their patients were using fish oil, but weren't really seeing a response. And then the conversation moved on. So I typed into chat, dose matters. People are underdosing themselves.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
So the Stoll study used 1.6 grams DHA. That was 15 tablets.
Right.
Okay. So people take a handful of pills and they said, "Oh, that's too much. I'll just take 1 or 2." Or I'll take a teaspoonful of fish oil. That's not the dose. It doesn't work.
At least nowadays we can get it a lot more concentrated. So you can, get the same amount with less pills, but it's still hard to do. And unfortunately, it's pricey. So,
right. So you just tell. So I have a lot of people on limited incomes, and so the practical thing to do to tell them to eat is to buy a can of salmon and eat a couple cans of salmon a day, and that's their food. And there's no reason why people shouldn't do that. There's
exactly.
Or sardines. So if you eat fish 3 meals a day. If you eat fish 3 times a day like I do, I have a quarter can of salmon for breakfast. I have a can of sardines for lunch, and I have a couple of maybe a half pound of fish for supper. That's going to be close to the kind of dose that matters, and it's something that's been done for thousands of years. People have been using fish oil since Pliny the Greek talked about it.
That's remarkable.
And it's safe. People talk about prolonged bleeding time, and there are some potential risks with heart arrhythmias, but there's no reported case in the literature that I'm aware of that somebody died from fish oil.
Yeah, I haven't heard of any either.
So it's like, oh, well, it's terrible. You might have prolonged bleeding. Well, the Eskimos have prolonged bleeding. And, they also don't die of heart attack so much. At least they used to before they got all the modern food that we do.
It makes me curious. I lived in Kodiak, Alaska for 2 years.
Oh, it's a beautiful place. Isn't it
beautiful?
That. I love Alaska, yeah.
And I spent quite a bit of time actually with Native families, Alaska Native families. And every time I was with an Alaskan family and they fed me, it was always accompanied by fermented seal oil.
Wow.
So fermented seal oil was as much a popular condiment there as ketchup is here.
Wow.
Okay. Now, it has quite a strong flavor. You do have to get used to it, but my body did and started like wanting it and liking it, and I'm dipping everything into this fermented seal oil. Now, we know that being fermented, it's very high in the probiotic, but it just made me think, I wonder what the fatty acid profile is of seal oil, seal blubber.
Well, I've never heard about seal blubber's concentration, but I certainly will tell you that an Alaska native that eats fish as part of their diet, completely different body composition. So we can
Mhm.
measure someone's body, whether it's muscle or fat or any tissue, and we could tell whether they're Japanese or Icelandic or someone eats a lot of fish versus an American that does not, because the composition of the body is determined by how much omega-3 that they've been eating over their lifetime. It's 2.5 years, 3 years is the half-life. So you can start eating these high doses of omega-3s and you're still going to be making a change in your body composition after 10 years. It's really quite a long-term deal. So what people find is that the epidemiological studies that show do people eat fish or not eat fish are a lot stronger than a study that lasts 6 months, giving a few doses. It's just a drop in the ocean compared to what your body is made of. And the fact that your body is composed of this kind of fat is fascinating. So what happens when someone is under stress? You get a surge of adrenaline, surge of the catecholamines is what you call them, but that makes the body release energy in the form of free fatty acids.
Mhm.
Okay. Now, most people in America, they release a arachidonic acid, which then goes on to be able to fight inflammation by making the prostaglandins and other inflammatory mediators that they can cause pain. For one, those prostaglandins are what we use or we target when we target with ibuprofen and some of the other pain medicines.
Right, right,
Versus
right.
if you're
Your PGE2.
right, exactly. But if you're eating fish, your body is now full of the DHA and the EPA instead of the arachidonic acid, and under stress, the EPA is released, which then goes on to make anti-inflammatory and moderating inflammation types of chemicals, and you get less pain. So here's my former friend and colleague Chris Ramsden did a study of headache pain, and he
Mhm.
wanted to show that the fatty acids matter because he figured that a
Sure.
chronic headache sufferer would have less pain if their body was making less of this prostaglandin that caused pain, as you mentioned. And so he'd had placebo-controlled double-blind diets, and the diet showed that when people ate high omega-6 diets versus low omega-6 diets and low
Right.
omega-6 diets with omega-3, they had less headache pain chronically.
I've heard of that study. Yeah.
Right. And that's because the body is now able to moderate its inflammation better. That's the way humans were designed. We were designed to have more even composition of omega-3 and omega-6 in our food supply.
Sure.
What really
As
happened back
animals are, your wild
right,
animals have much higher omega-3s to omega-6s in their fat composition.
right. So back in the day, 100 years ago, we didn't use, for instance, soybean oil is a great example. So there was no soybean oil in the population. Now, we probably consume about 25 pounds of soybean oil per person in America. In North America, the fatty acid, the omega-6 fatty acid from soybeans is the 18 carbon omega-6 fatty acid. That's provided the most energy for the entire North American continent, for all the animals and all the people. And when it gets into animals, it becomes part of their flesh. So we eat that omega-6 that comes from corn and soy fed beef and chickens and so forth. Whereas if you have a wild animal that's fed green leafy plants and maybe some omega-6, it's more balanced. And if we eat those kinds of animals, that's the kind of fat that we have. So if we eat a barnyard, typical feedlot fed beef cattle, that beef cattle will have lots of omega-6, and we get that omega-6 in our body. On the contrary, if you eat wild game or salmon, you get the
That's right.
omega-3.
Decades ago, when I first started studying this and became aware of this, I was taught that and this was, I don't know, at least 30 years ago, that over the previous 125 years, so now it'd be the previous 150 years, that the Western world's consumption of the omega-3 fatty acids has dropped by 80%.
That's about right. That makes sense. It changes the population. Now, here's the thing about the omega-6 and omega-3 composition of your diet affects your brain. Okay.
Mhm.
So what happens if you have lots of omega-3 is you've got a well-functioning brain. You've got the
Yes.
connectivity, the connections between the frontal lobe, which is your higher orders of thought, and your emotions. So you can control your emotions better. And
Mhm.
if you look at populations,
Less violence.
less violence, less irritability, less problems with heart disease and all that as well.
Yes.
But mostly, high fish diet seems to really promote interhuman connections. So if you look at populations around the world where there's lots of fish, you'll see less violent activity, less irritability, less homicide. And if you track it, you'll see that countries that have lots of fish consumption, they have less bipolar disorder, less depression, less postpartum depression, less homicide, less suicide. Suicide's kind of hard to really judge, but it really tracks with how well your brain works. Now, here's the thing. If you look at countries throughout the recorded history, those countries where they were fed lots of fish had high cohesive societies. That's where democracy developed in Greece, where people were fed fish all the time. And of course, in England, during the Elizabethan times, people ate fish. They had cod. Their brains worked really well. And Britain ruled the wave, ruled the whole world. And then they were beaten by who? The Americans, living on the seacoast eating fish. So there's a wonderful story about George Washington's troops. So we know that they were starving at Valley Forge, right? In the springtime, they went and fought the Battle of Monmouth, stood shoulder to shoulder with each other and fought the British on their own British terms. British fought in these lines like they did in continental Europe, and the British thought Americans can't fight like that. They just run away, or they just can only hide. But in this battle, the Americans stood their ground and beat the British. What happened between then? Well, between the starving time and between that battle, George Washington describes a providential run of shad up the Schuylkill River. And there were barrels and barrels of fish that those soldiers ate all spring in preparation for the time of that battle. And I always think it's fascinating how that prepared those men to stand shoulder to shoulder and
That's right.
And not run away.
And not run away. What a remarkable story.
The fish oil that people get when they're children was why did your grandparents have to give each other
a
cod?
teaspoon of cod liver oil.
Right. Why
morning.
Did that come? Do you know why that was? Well, they thought it would prevent vitamin A deficiency, which they thought might create more immunity to flu, but they also thought it would prevent antisocial behavior.
And it probably did.
It probably did. So if you talk to somebody who's very old, like octogenarian, they will oftentimes tell you that their parents gave them fish oil. And they're the ones that are still alive. They're the ones that you can tell are really together.
The ones who are still alive.
The ones that are emotionally together. Because they had that when their mothers were eating fish, and they were also eating the cod liver oil.
The cod liver oil. Now, I can't find the actual study now. I'm sure it's in the WHO. But in the 1980s, the World Health Organization published a recommendation that all pregnant and lactating women start supplementing with basically fish oil with the omega-3 fatty acids, because, of course, baby's brain in development is using up all of mom's omega-3s. Right. Now, this was the 1980s, John.
During the rations of the Second World War, people in Britain were given the cod liver oil for these purposes too.
Yeah. And that they recommended that preterm babies and bottle-fed babies be supplemented with DHA as well. And I think it started from, that's where they started using the algae. The United States was one of the last countries to start mandating putting DHA into a baby formula.
Yeah, that was some of the work of Norm Salem and Joe Hibbelin, some of the guys that I work with at NIAAA.
Yeah, yeah. Well, we're grateful to them. But most OBGYNs don't know this. They're not
Yeah.
recommending that their patients have high levels of omega-3s.
No,
And in my practice, most postpartum depression, now I know that the end stage, the really serious postpartum depression is high copper and, hormone dysregulation, but the normal run of the mill postpartum depression in my clinical experience is deficiency on the omega-3s.
absolutely. That's been shown in various studies.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah,
The more fish the mothers eat, the smarter the kids are. There's a fascinating study
right.
from England, the Allspac study. And this study looked at 14,000 mothers and their children over a long period of time. And they measured everything, all kinds of variables. And the variable that seemed to matter was whether the mother ate fish or not. And that predicted social ability. So if the children's mothers ate fish, they were less likely to have lying. They were less likely to steal. They were less likely to have behavioral problems of any kind. And it was such that the women who didn't eat any fish had children that were really more disturbed. And in those populations, the young baby girls grew up to have as much emotional problems as the boys did. And we know that boys always have more behavioral problems than girls, except in the mothers that didn't eat any fish.
Oh my goodness.
Right. It was really a huge study and very well done. Now, I will say that fish consumption back then was ocean fish, and it wasn't perhaps as polluted as it was now. Oftentimes, talk about fish, but we're not talking about tilapias and catfish raised in tanks because they're fed corn and soybeans just like
Yes.
the chicken.
Yes.
So that's not what we're talking. We're talking about ocean
And people
fish.
need to know that. People
Right.
need to know that your farm raised fish, even your farm raised salmon fed corn and soy, are going to have the higher level of omega-6s and less of the omega-3s.
Right. So it's really a mess. They've overfished the little baby fish, the Menhaden fish, and fed them to the farm-fed fish because the farm-fed fish have to have omega-3 in their diet. So they feed them little fish, which then don't grow up and become food
Big
for the other
fish.
fish. It's
Right.
just a mess. But it's important to know where these fats come from. So the thing about omega-6 and omega-3 fats is they're almost identical, but not quite. And the difference is one double bond in the
Uh-huh.
omega-3 position. And that one double bond in the omega-3s makes the omega-3s flexible. And so they have more, they swim around more, they can move around more, which changes what they're made into. But
Sure.
it also means that the flexibility is what's used in plants for different purposes. So the omega-3s come from the plant leaves, which are more flexible. The omega-3s come from the algae, which has to be in cold water because it stays flexible in cold water. Whereas the omega-6s are seed oils, which are stable at all kinds of temperatures, and they do
Right.
better. They have long shelf life. And so the omega-3s come from the ocean where there's lots of this algae, or they come from plant-eating animals. And the omega-6s come from seeds, which are the storage form of fats. And that's sort of where you get the difference from. And of course, this fish that eat the algae, they become full of the omega-3. And that's why we think of deep sea oily fish as having the best omega-3 content.
Well, that sort of makes me think about way back when the hunter-gatherers settled down and started growing crops.
Right,
And there would have been a shift in the food oils at that point in time. There would have to have been.
right. So that's where we really start to see the difference where people ate fish, they'd be more cohesive, they'd be better humans, right?
Yeah.
Which I always feel is why Jesus fed his disciples fish. That was the
Fish.
feeding of the
Fish. Well,
5,000 with
and half
fish.
of them were fish, and half of them were fishermen
Half of the
anyway.
fishermen, he picked his buddies, his friends to be people that had lots of fish because their human characteristics were optimized by the fish in their brain. That's the way I look at it.
So that's fascinating. So, do you know anything about gamma-linolenic acid, GLA, and PGE1?
I don't want to talk about things that I'm not certain about, so I'm going to pass on that one.
Okay, that's why I wanted to ask you because I'm looking for people who actually understand the science.
Well, that's not my area of expertise.
Right.
There's a lot of science that's wonderful to explore, and I've just touched a little bit of it in my
You're on
practice.
the PGE3 side of things.
Right. So, it's most scientists in America today just focus on one area and they become an
Right.
expert in that area. And if they're really good at it, they get a Nobel Prize. Some of us, that's the typical European scientist way. The American
Uh-huh.
scientist way is like, hey, there's a problem, let's see if we can fix it. And so
Uh,
I went into this whole nutritional problem because I saw the problems of people with alcoholism and I
right.
wanted to solve the problems. And I went to NIH and after seeing lots of alcohol problems among my patients who were homeless and could see that they had violence when they didn't eat well. And I could see that they had no they didn't want to be violent. They didn't want to get kicked out of their homes because they were, had lost their temper. And so I was curious about this. So when I went to NIH, that's what I did. I helped Dr. Ted George with a study he was doing, looking at people that lost their temper in a marriage. And so these are domestic abusers. And
Mhm.
we found, in fact, that they weren't just bad people. They also had brain issues. They were different and their
Okay,
brains were different.
so I'd like to follow that up, but here's my story with domestic abusers because I used to help run a domestic violence agency in Denver maybe 25 years ago. And what I noticed, and I knew some about the omega-3s back then, but not enough to talk to these guys about it. But what I did know about was blood sugar. And so periodically, I ran the female side of the agency, but periodically I would sub with the men.
Uh huh.
And I'd ask them, who had breakfast today? And half the room would raise their hand. And what did you have for breakfast? And they had consistently Captain Crunch and Mountain Dew. That's also breakfast in 25 years ago in the DUI groups that I would run. Right. But so I would give them the lecture about reactive hypoglycemia and low blood sugar creating adrenaline and adrenaline creating violence and loss of control, loss of impulse control. And I would challenge them to spend a week foregoing the Captain Crunch and Mountain Dew for just 1 week. I say you can do anything for 1 week and eat 20 grams of protein every 4 hours for 1 week. See, this is where my book came from, John, is all of these, experiences with
Right.
ordinary people. And they would stop me, these ex-cons, right, would stop me in the hallway with tears. And they would say, why hasn't anybody ever told me this before? I have not had one incidence of violence this week. I have not even been angry this week. I could flow with what happened and I could use the tools that you all are trying to teach us. I could actually remember to use them and use them. You mean what I eat matters to my violence? And it was like, yeah, it does. And then they got angry. Why didn't anybody ever tell me this before? I ended up in prison behind my violence. Why didn't anybody ever tell me this before?
That's a very moving story. It is so true. And in fact, if that public health message got out to everybody, it would change the American future. It really is huge when people lose their temper, they lose their families, they lose their jobs, and create a community that doesn't trust each other. But just feeding people so they don't get hungry. I always tried when I was working with the domestic violence research. I would say this is just feed your spouse before they lose their temper. I remember one fellow that was in our domestic violence study, and his wife had learned that when he came back from a 48-hour shift as a lineman with no food, that what she needed to do was to have food on the table when he walked in the door, and then she would leave. After he ate it, then they could come back. She could come back. And that was the way that she practically dealt with this issue. Why isn't this message spread everywhere? And it's really a critical
I want the
question.
money for billboards. I have this fantasy of billboards across the entire country with this message on it.
I've seen some of your ideas about that, and that could
Yeah.
be just the ticket to get people aware of these simple things that they can do to improve their lives.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's just a simple,
Exactly.
easy thing.
We really do need public health messaging, but that requires getting the attention of people who manage the purse strings, people who manage the messaging, and I'm just maybe not as quite as little clinician as I used to be. I think I'm getting a little more traction now than I used to have, but not enough. And we really all need to be figuring out how to catch the attention of people who have control over the public health messaging.
It's really true. So the other public health messaging, sort of an aside from the nutritional piece, so I use medications for my alcohol practice. And I remember, and we could stop people craving alcohol. If we use the medicine consistently, they'll overcome their sexual addiction to alcohol sometimes. But these medicines are really safe. They're inexpensive. They work. I remember I had one patient that came to see me. He was a Marine and he had a little family, and he was just his wife had decided to leave, and he was facing a divorce. And so he finally got a hold of me, found me, and helped him with some medication to reduce his craving for alcohol. And he was able to be successful. He eventually got off alcohol entirely. And after about 3 months, he hadn't had, much to drink at all, just very little. And he said to me, Doc, if someone had told me that medications exist that could stop my craving for alcohol, I'd still be married now. And I wouldn't be sharing custody with my wife for these kids. It just breaks your heart that this piece of information, and in fact, we're trying to get this information out that medicines can really help people overcome the
Now,
craving for
is this,
alcohol.
you're using medicines as kind of generically. Are we specifically talking about targeted naltrexone?
Well, that's one of the safest, most studied one. But this patient was on another medicine called acamprosate, which is also useful for alcohol problems. It is indicated for that, FDA indication for that.
Okay.
But there's about a half a dozen medications. We use topiramate, ondansetron, baclofen, even prazosin. Some other ones can also help reduce the craving for alcohol in the same way naltrexone does. But targeted naltrexone, following the Sinclair method, is the safest and the most commonly used way to go. And it works great.
Well, we probably can't do it today, but I would love to have you come back and talk about the actual biochemistry of how and why that works.
Sure.
Because, I get the watered down version, and I'm never satisfied with the watered down version. Because this flies in the face of everything that I was ever taught about alcohol use disorder.
Right. It doesn't fit with the model, so people don't do it.
It doesn't fit the models. The piece that I really, really want to understand is that switch, that loss of control switch. And I don't know that I have read the research that explains that loss of control switch versus any addiction, right? What is it when you move from social use of any substance or behavior to the actual addictive compulsive use where you have lost control and it's taken over? Now, some people, of course, start that way, but most people don't. Most people build up to that point of moving across the line. So these medications that turn that around have to be working at that point where that switch exists. What do you know about that switch?
You're asking me a big question, so I'll do my best to answer it. Now, alcoholism is devastating, complicated, but in a sense, kind of interesting disease because it has so many factors that are involved because humans are complicated. There's a spiritual component. When I was first
my three-legged stool, the biochemistry, the psychosocial, and the spiritual.
yes, all those things are very important. So should we go into that now, or do you want to talk about it on a future
Well, we
podcast?
probably should not go into it now because that's another hour-long conversation. But
But
I'm going to send you another invitation to come back so that we can have
Sure.
that conversation.
Sure.
Yeah.
No, that but of course, the nutritional part is the first part that helps people recognize what's going on. So my patients are unique in my particular private practice. Now, I've dealt with patients who have nothing. They're homeless street people. I've dealt with people that are court ordered to come to programs, and I've dealt now with a private practice for people that recognize I have a problem with alcohol.
A little high end.
They write and they look for me on the internet, and they still have a job, they have income, and they can see me as a private patient, and they'll come to see me and I'll go through the issues. Most of these people, they eat really well. Most of them don't eat as much fish as I recommend, but their brains are well enough working so they recognize they're addicted. All right, they're very logical. They see their problem, and the medicines can work because they'll take them.
Right.
Other people, sometimes if they don't take the medicines regularly, we have to deal with the brain. So you feed the brain with omega-3s, and all the vitamins are deficient in people with alcoholism. We haven't talked about folate or some of these other probiotics and so forth that are critical elements for healing that. But once the brain works well enough, then people can recognize their need. And that's why they see me. They're not in denial. They say, "Yeah, I've got a problem."
Well, this has been a fascinating conversation, which we will continue.
Great.
And so if anybody wants to contact you, how would they find you?
So I have a website, alcoholrecoverymedicine.com. And that's how they could find me and click on the button to make an appointment. If I don't see patients in all states, but where I'm licensed, I'll be glad to see them. And for people that don't want to make an appointment, I still put a lot of information on my website that's just there.
Oh, that's lovely. So we'll make sure to put the link to that in the show notes. And everyone, I want to thank you for joining us today. If you've enjoyed this lively conversation we just had, please press the like button and the subscribe button and share it with as many friends, colleagues, family members as you possibly can. And I will see you next time. And John, thank you so much for joining us today.
You're so welcome. Keep up the good work, Christina.
Thank you for tuning in to Power Up Recovery with Nutrition. I'm Christina Veselak, your host, and I hope today's episode has inspired and equipped you with new insights and tools to support your recovery journey or practice. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave a review, and share it with others who could benefit from the knowledge shared here. Stay connected with us for more episodes filled with practical advice, expert wisdom, and inspiring recovery stories. Remember, nutrition is a powerful tool in mental health and relapse prevention. Power up your recovery today. I'm Christina Veselak, and I'll see you next time.